Again, welcome. And again, I'm Aaron Clausen, the principal planner for the City of Lynn, here with Van Du from MAPC, who has been leading the charge on this hazard mitigation planning update. Just before we get started and welcoming some folks, I want to note that we've been carrying out this process now, I think I want to say for six to 7 months, and we've got together with us a pretty large working group made of a number of different city agencies, who engage with hazard mitigation or hazard response, or otherwise have other infrastructure in the city that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about hazard mitigation. I just want to call out some names of folks who I see are on the call here. And if I miss you, I apologize. Please just feel free to raise your hand and make sure I catch it. I just want to make sure we acknowledge your work on this. So Etta Madchik from the Community Development Department. I see Dave Brown from the Police Department is here. I saw Reg Downey from Emergency Management hopped on as well. And I also believe that our new city councilor, Coco Ellensug, is also with us this evening. So thank you all for joining us once again. So we've been going through a process of, I'll leave it to Van to kind of get into the details, but for a while here, we've been doing some analysis in terms of vulnerabilities that we're facing in the city, prioritizing those. And we've had one public meeting. This meeting tonight is our second, will be the final, and will culminate in a revised and updated multi-hazard mitigation plan that will be updated from the last one, which was done in 2016. So I'm going to just hand it off to Van and let Van kind of walk us through the rest of the presentation. And we'll also have some opportunity at the end of the meeting for some Q&A and commentary. So thank you, Van, take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks everyone for joining tonight. As Aaron mentioned, this is the second and final public meeting. For tonight, we'll go over a summary of what we've done to date over the past 6-7 months, share some findings with you, and also just giving an opportunity to gather input, feedback before we submit this draft hazard mitigation plan to FEMA. And so just briefly, communities are required to adopt and update the hazard mitigation plan every 5 years in order to be eligible for FEMA grant funding. The last plan for Lynn was completed in 2016. And so this 2021 plan update, I know we've been working on this, so it's a 2021 plan, but it is 2022. When approved by MEMA and FEMA, hopefully in the next few weeks when we can submit, and then adopted by the city, will keep Lynn in good status for FEMA funding over the next 5 years. And there are a lot, as you probably know or have heard, quite a good bit of funding availability for resilience projects across the country. So natural hazard mitigation planning entails looking at data related to, these natural conditions. The majority of these hazards are citywide for Lynn. Given the city's location, Lynn is highly susceptible to hazards like flooding, extreme storm events, and related impacts like wind. I think we've heard quite a bit about extreme rain events, windstorms recently as well. Brush fires and droughts are moderate, though it is anticipated regionally that we will experience more extreme temperatures. In addition, warmer winter could mean precipitation may become more in a form of rain than snow. Except don't forget what I just said about, regarding this Friday, but we'll see more rain than snow and more frequent heat waves and drought conditions compounded by intense spurts of heavy downpour. So that overall increases the risk of landslides. One new item here, which is not really new, is thinking about climate change considerations, which is something that MEMA and FEMA have really pushed all communities to incorporate into their hazard mitigation planning. And just to note that this is a hazard mitigation plan and not the city's emergency response plan. That's a separate effort as well. But we do draw feedback from folks working on that plan, as well as information from that, just to make sure everything is aligned. And here's the standard plan development steps for a hazard mitigation plan. We're pretty much near the end of this process. The local hazard mitigation plan team met 3 times in April or late April, early May, and then again in July, and then again in late August, early September. We look at critical infrastructure and local hazard areas throughout the cities, assessing existing measures for the effectiveness. We'll also review proposed mitigation measures from the previous plan to see where they're at in progress or completed, and any that is not completed, whether it's worth carrying it over to this new plan update. And then identify new ones to be included. And for this one particularly, we draw majorly from the recent municipal vulnerability preparedness program planning workshops that Lynn has completed in 2019 as well. So here is just a broad high level map to show you the areas in Lynn that are prone to flooding, brush fires, and coastal erosion. So the flooding is in the blue area that you can see here. The brush fires are kind of outlined in the red, and of course coastal flooding coastal erosion is in the purple, which is likely down in this area. And I just want to share also just a snapshot of some highlighted critical infrastructure and facilities, as well as hazard areas that we noted and consider when developing mitigation measures for this plan update. I want to assure you that this list is not comprehensive, what you see on here. It does give you a snapshot of different hazards we consider, places that we know from, based on feedback from the local team that has been kind of brainstormed together, as well as from public comments that we've received to date. So we're looking at, critical infrastructures and facilities, including kind of bridges, roadways, municipal facilities. We're looking at park and recreation areas, schools, social services facilities, housing, and then of course hazardous material sites. Excuse me. And then in terms of identify hazard areas, focus again, as you see on the map, kind of those 3 categories of brush fires, flooding, and coastal erosion. And so before we dive into the mitigation measures that we've developed, I want to share just in the next few slides, a quick review of the climate change conditions and potential impacts on our region and to Lynn specifically where possible. What you see here is projections for more rain annually and larger rain events generally. This charts here kind of show projections for the 10-year, 24-hour storm. That means the largest 24-hour rainstorm that is expected to happen on average every 10 years. This figure and kind of calculations is typically used for stormwater calculations. But what you can kind of take away from here is that the precipitation volume has increased since 1960 or so over time. I want to note also that even though, as I mentioned before, more rain is projected, it is also true that more frequent summer and fall droughts are also anticipated due to combinations of earlier snow melt, less rain in those seasons, and warmer temperature. And then, thinking back, you might remember the storms in March 2010, as well as the rainstorms in August 2018. Those are kind of the extreme type of storms that produce extreme flooding, but predicted to occur more frequently as the changing climate. And so it means extreme rainfall amount falling in winter as rain and snow again, and then on ground saturated with snow melt, and while vegetation is still dormant, so flooding, landslides, all of that risk that we need to take into consideration. And then on the other side, we're thinking about extreme heat as well. And generally it is anticipated in our region and in the state that we'll experience more days over 90 degrees. What you see here are tree coverage in the kind of, the greener spot here. And the pink areas on the map represent the hottest 5% of land temperatures, but this is across the MAPC communities. But as you just kind of look at this, you can kind of see that the downtown area here with less tree coverage tends to have kind of hosted the more hotspot areas. And then, of course, sea level rise projections and impacts of the city. What I have here is data from the Woodholes group that produced for MassDOT. It shows its projected likelihood and depth of flooding, sea level rise increase at 1.2 feet, 2.4 feet, and 4.2. And so the reason why, that's a little bit, I think, more accurate in terms of thinking about the impact when based on the extent of the sea level rise, instead of kind of, it's harder to put the timing to it, but we kind of have a good sense of the 1.2 feet rise will be roughly around the 2030, the year of 2030 timeframe. 2.4 is probably around 2050, and 4.2 is around 2070. So just to give you that idea. And then the red area here we kind of show is the FEMA 1% flood zones. Just to give you a sense, these two data sets are not meant to be comparable because of different methodology use. So the takeaway I want you to have is that they just show similar areas and extent flooding, for the city of Lynn here. And of course, given that projections and potential damage, we want to think about the extent to which Lynn's shorelines, existing infrastructures, homes that are going to be at risk or damaged, and of course, the associated costs with that. Here are just some number calculations that was included as part of your MVP planning effort back in 2019 as well. Excuse me. And of course, based on the latest statewide hazard mitigation plan, it noted that Essex County, which Lynn is part of, experienced the most flooding impacts in the last decades. So all these things are unfortunately lining up together. And I want to also talk about the social impacts related to these hazard events. When thinking about who will be impacted by natural and climate hazards, it is most certain that we won't all be affected equally. Some of us are more physically susceptible to impacts, particularly heat, for example, for young children, pregnant women, older adults, people with chronic diseases or disability, things like that. And Lynn is a very diverse community, as you all know and aware of. And so it's also a low and moderate income community compared to the median income in the area as well as statewide. And so these are the things we have to take into considerations as well, with the limited financial resources, which they will have more difficulty preparing for and recovering from hazard events. And so thinking of the resources, what do we need, what we should provide, aside from education and awareness, but additional resources to support should an event took place or impacts happen. And also just quickly, you can see the differences in health outcomes by race, reflecting the reality that longstanding societal inequities can lead to different health outcomes based on race and ethnicity. And so extreme heat, there have been more studies now known to show trigger of asthma attack, and especially in kind of low income community or environmental justice communities where they're kind of everything is compounded. And then again, here's just a quick snapshot of the latest environmental justice populations map, available for Lynn from the state. So now we'll get into the mitigation planning and solutions based on all of these risk and vulnerability assessment that we learned over the past few months. I want to turn it over to Erin again to discuss first kind of the priority actions that came out of the Lynn MVP climate planning back in 2019.
Sure, thank you, Van. And so the Municipal Vulnerability Program is a program through the State Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. It essentially creates a planning process it's generally pretty formulaic, but similar to this mitigation plan, except for it's really more focused on vulnerabilities that we can expect from climate change. So some of the things we've talked about already are sea level rise, inland flooding due to heavy precipitation events, rain events, and then again drought in heat events. So some of these are a short list of some of the higher level actions that came out of that planning process, like protecting the waterfront marina from sea level rise, reducing coastal and riverine flooding, implementing opportunities to enhance communication. So there's a social aspect of this, is making sure that we're able to communicate and help the community and individuals and households, businesses protect and respond to climate change. And then, of course, looking at other kind of critical environmental areas like the Saugus River area, in the development area of critical environmental concern management plan, namely around the Saugus River. That plan identified a number of actions. One of them was to further study the Strawberry Brook watershed, which is this map on the right is showing you that watershed. It's essentially a waterway that's been essentially undergrounded. It's been culverted under in the city as the city urbanized over time. And really the only surface waters that would tell you that there's actually a waterway that drains and empties into the Saugus Rivers, the Cedar Brook Pond or the Flax Pond or Sluice Pond. Those are, surface water bodies connected with that waterway that otherwise travels underground. But as many folks on this meeting know, and residents and businesses, that a lot of the inland flooding that takes place in the city is experienced around this water body. And it's, particularly around Boston Street. The Boston Street corridor really runs parallel to the waterway before it kind of takes a left turn under Berry Park and GEAA Field and outlets into Saugus River. So that plan essentially modeled, future stormwater events, I think in 2015, 2070, looking out into the future to identify what the hydrology might look like due to climate change and heavier rain events. And then, taking that information, identified some of the problem areas that we all know now and how they will be exacerbated in the future. Ultimately offering up about 11 different actions the city can take to mitigate that flooding impact. One of them is the Boston Street Green Infrastructure Pilot Program that will be building this spring, which is implementing a couple bioswales on Boston Street, which will be able to essentially capture stormwater flow, hold it, and pull it out of that system so that it mitigates the flooding. Bioswales also improve stormwater quality, removes a lot of the contaminants that flow in stormwater as it's kind of shedding into the system. And then gives us also an opportunity to kind of get a co-benefit of installing street trees in those areas that Van mentioned, where we have high heat concern with low tree canopy, kind of elevating that heat island effect. So we kind of get a co-benefit of minimizing that outcome. So that's a project that will be happening in the spring. We're also looking at Berry Park, implementing a pervious pavement area there right next to one of the ball fields for parking, and some other bioswales, again, to kind of expand that stormwater mitigation and flooding mitigation. It's a useful tool because it's a disaggregate approach. We can essentially build these bioswales throughout the watershed to mitigate flooding. The other action item that I just hit on before we move on to the rest of this plan is an outlet control structure for a Cedar Brook Pond. Essentially gives us the opportunity to utilize that pond as a stormwater capture system, and through real-time analysis, essentially allow water to flow out of the pond when there's no rain in advance of a rain event, because we know they're coming, close the structure and essentially capture and hold the rainwater while it's raining. And that can hold several 100,000 cubic yards of rainwater during a certain event, which is a pretty big impact to the watershed. It's very relevant to this planning process because the funding that we're seeking for the design and engineering of that is through the BRIC program, which is a FEMA funded program. And this plan itself, once it, presuming it's adopted and expect it would be and approved by FEMA, is a necessary step in receiving that funding to design that structure and implement that mitigation in the future. So just a couple examples of some actions that that we'll be taking as a community to mitigate flooding in this area. Going forward, we can look at other areas like like the Saugus River tidal area, finding out ways that we can mitigate flooding along the River Street neighborhood we've heard a lot about, and around the corner around Route 107 where we heard some flooding. So these are other areas that we can look at going forward.
Sounds good. Thanks, Aaron. Just one thing to add is that this MVP planning process and the priority actions that that is available here is kind of the results of community workshopping together. And so these are all you have like the community's ideas as well, which has been really helpful and really gave us a great jump start when thinking about proposed mitigation measures for this upcoming plan, kind of like the wish list that we want to have, and then kind of chip away slowly through funding, FEMA funding pursuit. And as Aaron mentioned too, there are a few projects and measures and so that are initiatives that are rolling or getting going over the next few months, this upcoming years. There are also existing and ongoing mitigation measures I'm showing here that are built into Lynn's policies, regulations, standards, and practices already. These are still these are still all effective and will be ongoing. That will be reviewed frequently just to make sure that it's staying aligned with the hazard mitigation plans solutions that we'll be focusing on. And so with that, I'm going to share with you in the next couple of slides kind of the proposed mitigation measures that we'll add to the plan update. Some of them will be, you see that it will be specific when we can be specific and we know those are the prioritized projects wanted by the community or has been talked about, discussed, and kind of getting, kind of coming more together over time. And then there are some mitigation measures where we, like I said, it's a wish list, a nice wish list to have. It doesn't hurt to include. So some might be more broad and it's kind of like a citywide effort, but that's okay because once we have it in this plan and the plan gets adopted, then it's there. And then when you go and pursue more specific FEMA funding, that's where you can draw out and then, really design a comprehensive program that support that action and for specific communities or areas as you see needed. So here are some for inland flooding. Thinking about green infrastructure, low impact development, and other climate change resilient solutions, start implementing it and promoting it, evaluating and implementing stormwater and flood mitigation solutions, specifically for city-owned properties and flood-prone areas. Again, culverts, drainage system. I think this is kind of major and prioritized issues in the city to call out. Of course, given Lynn's location, coastal flooding and coastal erosion are the second next priorities. And so here are just some key mitigation measures that we're proposing and including in the plan. We're also looking at, evaluating critical facilities as there will be more severe winter storm, nor'easter that anticipated. Thinking about weather risk awareness activities, promoting, encouraging these outreach programs to make sure that we're preparing not only the city's operations, but also the residents to make sure that everyone is prepared and are able to respond to these climate impacts as well. And again, as Erin mentioned, think about drought and extreme heat, as we also see in that map of tree canopies and hotspot before. So just some thought here in terms of tree management, planting and management, and thinking about kind of the overall forest tree management planning for the city. And of course, the other hazards, including landslides, wildfires, invasive species, and of course, just multi-hazard. So thinking about, again, here, this is where we are aligning with the emergency response plan in terms of thinking of, aligning and updating so that they're kind of in tandem and updated, coordinating with social services agency to think of, the identify vulnerable populations, which you've done in the MVP planning process. And so now it's kind of working with community groups, organizations available in the city to really amp up and provide, make sure you kind of pull together the resources for that. And additional shelters, aside from being in school, so that everyone, it can be more inclusive that for those that need to seek out shelters. So with that, here are the next steps for the project. And as you've been hearing me, I kept saying that here's a snapshot of this and that. And so we'll give you the next 10 days as a public comment review so that you can really dive into the draft plan for more feedback and comments. So, but we're gonna aim to post the draft plan up by tomorrow. I will follow up with an email and the link to the plan so that you can download and read. It's delightful. There are many pretty maps in there. Hopefully you'll feel the same way. And so over the next 10 days, we'll kind of let the public review and provide comments before we incorporate them as appropriate, and then we'll submit the draft plan to MEMA and FEMA to be reviewed. They'll provide comment and revisions will take place as necessary. And once we get that conditional approval, then it'll go to the city to vote to adopt the plan. And like I mentioned before, once adopted, this plan will put the city in good status for the next 5 years in terms of pursuing FEMA funding. And yeah, so that's all we really want to share with you today. Thank you. So I think we can open up for questions and suggestions and comments.
We can both, just to jump in, Van, really briefly, as people are trying to maybe internalize a lot of that information that we just threw at you. Please feel free to offer up questions and comments in the chat function, or if you want to raise your hand or just come on screen and ask a question, I'm happy to do that. I'll just note that the plan itself is rather lengthy. There's a lot of great information there. In terms of the actual hazards themselves, the vulnerabilities, and sort of the vulnerability assessment that took place. And so there's a lot of good stuff to dig into. So I see first question there, Captain Archer.
As far as the bioswales that you talked about for the Strawberry Brook, as you mentioned, I think we all know that's been the source of a lot of problems for us, flooding, especially in that Boston Street corridor, but spread it out from there. Can you just explain, go into a little bit of how that works? It's going to divert water from Strawberry Brook, and where does it divert the water to? Or how does that whole process work? Sure. Without getting too technical for us?
Yeah, I'll try not to be too technical, and I don't think I could if I tried, to be honest with you, Captain. Basically, bioswales are intended to operate more like natural environments. So generally, if you're in an unurbanized area where you don't have so much impervious area, rain falls, it falls on the ground and slowly matriculates into the soil and goes into the groundwater, and then eventually may flow to a surface water body. And it's a slower process that prevents the amount of volume of water to flow directly into open water bodies. It also helps clean water as it falls. If you're in a rural area, it's maybe less dirty, but as water sort of sheds over impervious areas, it picks up fines and other kinds of pollutants and carries that into water bodies. By infiltrating through the ground, it sort of cleans that like a sponge might. So a bioswale is intended to operate more like the natural environment. And what happens is we basically have been able to find some space in the right of way where we can build essentially a grassy area, or an impervious grassy soil type area that has a void space. So water would essentially drain into that space, slowly kind of matriculate through some soil. And in this case, because we had a little extra room, we are also building an underground storage feature. It's sort of like I've heard it described like a plastic milk crate. So you put that underground and it creates a pretty large void space that just essentially holds water for the first, I don't know, say in this case, there's a calculation for it, but the first couple inches of stormwater, it captures all of that from a larger watershed. And then eventually it either just stays there and slowly drains into the ground. If it's a heavy rain event, there is an outflow that would then go into a catch basin, but it basically holds and slowly captures that over a longer period of time. And so it holds it, but also slows that flow of water into the surface water, in this case, Strawberry Brook in the conduit underground. And that slowing is also important because all the water that doesn't go into that bioswale and drains into the underground system is happening immediately. It's flowing through and kind of flowing into the Saugus River over time. As you're slowing it into these bioswales, you're holding that back even if it eventually gets into that system. So you're creating more space over time. Now, admittedly, the two bioswales that we're talking about are not going to solve the problem for the entire watershed, and the watershed covers about a third of the city. But it's something that we can implement over time in a disaggregate manner that after time can actually have a significant impact on the flooding in the corridor. And just a real quick note too, for folks who really want to get into the technical aspects of that, in the Lynn Common, and I'll put the link up in the chat in just a moment, webpage, it's essentially the planning project page. We have a fair amount of information about the Strawberry Brook watershed study that did a lot of the modeling for stormwater flows in the future, but also talks about those actions and how they actually work in that context. So it's really, it can be an interesting document to dig into. So I'll put that up in the chat for those who are interested.
Oh, that's pretty exciting. And that's a project you said that's scheduled to begin as soon as the spring.
Yeah, exactly. We were hoping to start before winter, but we couldn't get the plans and specs ready. So yeah, we would expect it would begin as soon as the freeze thaws around, say, April.
Oh, wow, it's pretty cool. That's very exciting. Thanks.
Thank you. Dave, do you have a comment?
It's just staying focused. How are you? Staying focused on the Strawberry Brook. It flows into the Saugus River from Flax Pond, correct? On the brook's underground. And then from Flax Pond, it flows from Sluice Pond into Flax Pond. And then I'm going backwards. And then from Cedar Brook Pond into Sluice Pond. My question is, what flows into the Cedar Brook Pond area? Is it just strictly watershed, or is there another source of water or another brook that goes into the Cedar Brook Pond?
Yeah, there's a smaller brook that does go into Cedar Brook. The headwaters are, I think there's two separate headwaters that do flow into Cedar Brook. One of them is just on the other side of Linfield Street in the park, and then the other one is up towards Peabody. But they're minor, they're small, they're really small brooks at that point. Mm-hmm. The headwaters are really small, and the ponds themselves, Cedar Brook, Flax, and Sluice, are they're essentially man-made water bodies over time that the outfall structures kind of hold the water in its place. So that one project I was talking about, the outfall at Cedar Brook Pond, would give us the opportunity to this is not a technical way of describing it, but essentially open and close that outfall so that prior to a rain event, now that we have fairly robust forecasting technology. Now we know when we're going to get a rain event, we can open that up and let the water out. And then just before the rain happens, close it up. And by letting all the water out, you create a lot of storage capacity. So it's a really interesting kind of low cost approach to capture that rain. And by holding it in the pond, you're essentially holding it up again, like the bioswale, you're holding it in place so that once the rain event's over, then you can open up and let it flow through the system, and you're creating capacity in that way. I don't know if that's where you're getting at, but
Yeah, that's exactly. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Any other question? I did have one in the chat. Any specific mitigation plans for Lynn Shore Drive? And Aaron, you can jump in. We don't have a specific project or project idea for Lynn Shore Drive at this moment or in this plan. It is included and mentioned, and we are well aware of all the flooding, and it's with Lynn Shore Drive as the kind of the barrier for the coastal barrier as well. And so there are more broadly citywide, but measures included in terms of mitigation measures for the coastal erosions to continue monitoring and maintaining and coming up with like a capital needs plan to address as they come up.
Yeah, there aren't, as Van pointed out, there's no specific project along Lynn Shore Drive. As I think most everybody knows, that's a DCR piece of infrastructure. The seawall actually does a pretty good job right now preventing flooding for the most part. Some of the mapping that Van put together as part of the hazard mitigation plan does point out as Lynn Shore Drive turns into the rotary and becomes Lynnway, that area does flood. And I'm sure everybody who's on this call have experienced and seen that to a certain degree. There are, down in that end of things, there are some actions that we can look more closely at, or should look more closely at, in partnership with Lynn Water and Sewer and DCR to make sure that we're preventing that. Some other approaches that we really need to look at, particularly when it comes to shoreline erosion, but flooding that is tidal and really due to sea level rise rather than inland flooding, is looking at a storm path analysis. Essentially, in the map that Van showed, you could see in certain future events that 1, 2, and 4 foot sea level rise scenarios, almost the entire shoreline is underwater. But there's some deeper analysis that we can do to identify where are those kind of sort of choke points, I guess, or where the water is actually making its way inland. And so it's not necessarily the case that that entire shoreline is the cause of the problem. There may be different points along the shoreline where water's coming in, and because of the topography and elevation adjacent to the shoreline, you see flooding kind of happen up and around it. So there's some deeper analysis that we can and should do to get a better sense of where are the priorities, where are the kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will. I wouldn't say low cost, because a lot of this stuff can be extremely expensive, but how can we identify the areas that will have significant impact in mitigating that sort of flooding that you're seeing there. So this essentially helps us identify where we need to focus some of our attention going forward, and also helps us identify, and the plan does a pretty full analysis on all the different regional stakeholders and agencies that we need to engage, like DCR, but MassDOT, MBTA, with the rail system, who we need to engage with and partner as we look to advance mitigation measures.
Well, this is great. Thank you all. Like I said, we will post the recording of this for those who cannot be here with us tonight, as well as the draft plan, so that you can have 10 days to review in more detail and provide us with additional feedback or any questions you have.
Real briefly too, Van, thank you. I put in the chat the webpage, the web link to Lynn in Common. Tomorrow, if you go on the page at 8 o'clock in the morning, you won't see it, but we will have it up tomorrow. By the end of the day, we'll have a project page for the hazard mitigation plan with a link to the draft plan. And if you're at all interested in this, it's worth taking a look at and digging into some of the analysis. We'll also have my email address up there, and I'm going to offer Van your email address too. If you have a comment, please feel free to email us directly. We'll essentially compile all those comments and provide sort of some response to them, and after that 10-day period.
Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
All right, thank you.
Hear from you soon.
Bye, everybody. Have a good night.